Hey there, sleepyheads, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, as the world outside begins to quiet its ceaseless hum, we're going to gently drift back in time to an era often painted with broad romantic strokes, but one whose foundational realities were, to put it mildly, deeply uncomfortable. We're talking about the medieval world, an age where the very air you breathed, the ground you walked on, and the walls around you dictated almost every aspect of your daily existence, especially when it came to something as fundamental as personal hygiene. Allow your mind to softly drift as we journey back to a time when cleanliness was less about spotless surfaces and more about sheer daily survival. Imagine, if you will, that you're waking in a medieval home. It doesn't matter much if you're a commoner or a lord, because in this particular reality, some fundamental truths are universally binding. Your home, regardless of its size or material, inherently lacks all the modern amenities you take for granted. There's no indoor plumbing, no central heating to chase away the morning chill, and certainly no efficient waste disposal system humming quietly in the background. This stark absence of infrastructure doesn't just make life inconvenient. It fundamentally shapes every single one of your daily hygiene routines, turning what we consider simple into a constant, often exhausting effort. If you're a commoner, your dwelling is likely a rudimentary, perhaps even drafty structure crafted from thatch and timber. You feel the wind whisper through gaps in the walls, a constant reminder of the elements that press in from all sides. Privacy is a luxury you simply do not possess, barely a concept in a single-room hut shared with your entire family. The effort required for even a basic personal cleaning is considerable, a chore that leaves a persistent chill clinging to your skin, especially in the cooler months. You might shiver, pulling your rough wool tunic tighter as you consider the cold water you'd need to fetch for even a quick splash. Even if you were born into nobility inhabiting a grander stone dwelling, your reality isn't entirely different in its foundational challenges. Your warmth comes from an open hearth, its smoke curling upwards, often lingering in the interior. This perpetual wood smoke doesn't just sting your eyes sometimes. It contributes to the grime that settles on every surface, including your skin and hair, and inevitably reduces the air quality, giving everything a faint, smoky, damp scent. You might find yourself unconsciously rubbing at a thin layer of soot on your arm, a futile gesture against the omnipresent airborne dust. The very fabric of your home, whether stone or timber, struggles against the weather. Proper insulation is a dream for a distant future, and robust construction means little when a persistent drizzle can find its way in, leaving patches of dampness. Any water you manage to collect for washing, likely hauled in by servants, quickly becomes frigid, deterring any thought of frequent or thorough cleansing. You learn to accept a certain level of cold discomfort as a part of life, a constant, subtle impediment to anything resembling modern cleanliness. As you try to shake off the persistent chill and the ever-present earthy scent of your dwelling, your thoughts inevitably turn to the shared living spaces you inhabit. You quickly realise that true privacy, especially for personal care, is an almost alien concept in this medieval existence. Shared living spaces are the undisputed norm, whether you are a peasant huddled with your entire family, sometimes even extended household members in a single small room, or a noble residing in a great hall where servants and retainers are constantly present. Every daily routine, from eating to mending clothes and, yes, even rudimentary attempts at personal care, unfolds in close proximity to others. Imagine trying to perform even the simplest act of washing. Perhaps just your face and hands, with half a dozen sets of eyes, both innocent and curious, observing your every move. It severely limits any sense of individual agency and hygiene, amplifying the constant, unavoidable presence of others. You learn to make quick, almost surreptitious movements, or perhaps more likely you simply grow accustomed to the lack of boundaries, accepting it as an inescapable part of your collective existence. Adding another layer to this intimate, often uncomfortably close quarters living is the constant pervasive presence of animals. If you are a commoner, your livestock, perhaps a pig, a few chickens, or even a cow, might share a portion of your living space, or at the very least be housed directly adjacent to it. This isn't just a quaint pastoral detail. It introduces a symphony of pervasive smells from dung to wet straw and contributes significantly to the relentless battle against pests. Fleas and lice aren't just an external nuisance. They are part of the very fabric of your domestic environment. Even in more affluent dwellings, domestic animals like dogs and cats, while perhaps better trained, still add to the general uncleanliness. They shed, they bring in dirt, and they too are host to their own collection of parasites, all of which eventually find their way to you. You find yourself constantly scratching an itch you can't quite locate, a subtle, underlying discomfort that is never truly absent. The very air you breathe within your home is a testament to the ongoing environmental challenges. If your abode is a grand stone castle, you're in a perpetual battle against dampness. Stone walls, while formidable, are notoriously cold and prone to retaining moisture, leading to a persistent, earthy, sometimes mildewy smell that clings to tapestries, clothes, and eventually to you. It's a musty backdrop to life, a constant reminder of the cold, hard reality of your surroundings. If you inhabit a peasant's hut, the smells are different but no less pervasive. The scent of damp earth wood smoke, perhaps the tang of fermentation from stored foodstuffs, and the ever-present odour of unwashed bodies and unmanaged waste. These aren't just minor inconveniences. They create a persistent sensory environment that subtly yet profoundly influences your personal sense of cleanliness and comfort. You might try to air out your dwelling, but the outside air often brings its own collection of smells. The nearby refuse pit, the communal animal pens, or simply the damp, undrained earth. The struggle isn't just about feeling clean, or even being clean as you would understand it. It's about managing the constant influx of dirt, damp, and the living organisms that thrive in such conditions. Your world is one where every surface, every breath, and every moment carries the subtle weight of its foundational realities, leading you directly to the next vital concern, your daily sustenance. As your stomach rumbles, demanding attention, you become keenly aware of another foundational reality shaping your medieval life, your diet. It's a monotonous and often coarse affair, heavily reliant on grains. Think barley, oats and rye, and seasonal vegetables, assuming the harvest has been good. This isn't just about the taste. It subtly yet profoundly impacts your personal scent and internal well-being. Without a modern understanding of internal health, you might not connect your frequent digestive issues or distinct body odours to the high fibre low variety diet, but they are undeniably linked. It's a subtle yet pervasive element of your personal bouquet, a constant backdrop to your existence. You might wish for something sweeter, something lighter, but such desires are luxuries, not realities. Then there are the ever-present spectres of food scarcity. Harsh winters, especially after a poor harvest, can bring true hunger to your doorstep. You experience periods where meals are significantly reduced, sometimes to mere gruel. This isn't just unpleasant. It weakens your immune system, making you feel constantly vulnerable. In a world where hygiene is rudimentary at best and disease is an ever-present threat, a weakened body is an open invitation for sickness. You feel the dull ache in your muscles, the persistent gnawing in your stomach, and recognize that this vulnerability is not just a personal struggle, but a collective one, a shared burden that silently shapes every interaction and every day. The methods used to preserve food are also a double-edged sword. Heavy salting for meats, a necessity to prevent spoilage, or pickling for vegetables ensures food lasts through lean times. But this reliance on sodium-rich foods impacts your overall health in ways you don't comprehend. Your teeth in particular bear the brunt of this diet. The abrasive, often tough and highly salted foods contribute to wear and tear, leading to early dental problems. You might feel a dull ache in your molars or experience the sharp, sudden pain of a cracked tooth, knowing that relief, if it comes at all, will be brutal and short-lived. A perfect pearly white smile is the stuff of angels and distant fables not for the likes of you. And then there's the water. Every sip is a potential gamble. Your drinking water sources are often shared with livestock, the same streams where cattle drink and muddy their hooves, or wells that might be contaminated by runoff from nearby waste. This constant threat of waterborne illnesses is a pervasive anxiety lurking beneath the surface of daily life. No amount of external washing, however diligent or infrequent, can protect you from what you ingest. You simply fill your pitcher perhaps from a communal pump, and hope for the best understanding on a primal level that every gulp carries a risk. It's a stark reminder that even the most basic necessities of life are fraught with peril. For commoners like you, meals are basic and unvaried, prepared with rudimentary tools over an open fire, often in less than sanitary conditions. Dust from the hearth settles on everything, and shared trenchers or wooden bowls are quickly wiped clean but never truly sterilised. This adds another layer to the daily challenge of health and cleanliness, from the unwashed hands preparing the food to the communal sharing of utensils. Even if you were among the wealthier, your diet, while offering more variety, perhaps more spiced meats, finer breads and imported wines, still lacks modern nutritional understanding. The rich, often heavily spiced foods contribute to the unique bouquet of medieval life, a complex mix of culinary and personal odors that becomes a sensory signature of the era. You might enjoy the exotic flavors, but you're still part of that distinct fragrant tapestry. With such fundamental limitations on sustenance, your attention inevitably turns to the most personal aspects of daily life hygiene and personal care. With the pervasive challenges of your living conditions and diet firmly established, your thoughts, perhaps reluctantly, now turn to the most intimate and revealing aspect of medieval life: personal hygiene. This isn't just about feeling fresh. It's a story woven with profound cultural shifts, deep-seated fears, and ingenious, if often crude, adaptations. In the early Middle Ages, something rather surprising occurred. At least from your modern perspective, bathing was actually quite accepted and practiced. Lingering Roman traditions where public baths were central to civic life still held some sway, particularly in areas that had once been Roman provinces. You might have seen communal bathhouses or even enjoyed the occasional soak, recognizing it as a beneficial act, a brief period of perceived cleanliness and social interaction. Monastic communities too often maintained bathing as part of their routines, seeing it as a way to maintain physical health and purity for spiritual purposes. For a time, water was your friend, or at least a tolerated acquaintance. However, as the centuries advanced, particularly by the late medieval period, a profound and rather chilling shift began to occur. This wasn't driven by a new understanding of germs, for such knowledge was millennia away, but by fear and superstition. A terrifying belief took root: hot water, it was widely thought, opened your pores, and through these open pores, sickness, disease, and most terrifyingly, the dreaded plague could seep in, directly entering your body. The very act of taking a warm bath, which you might associate with relaxation, became a dangerous invitation for illness, making you feel quite literally like a sponge for death. The comforting warmth of water was now a potential gateway to your demise. This belief system entirely transformed your relationship with water. What was once seen as a cleansing agent became something treacherous, a silent conspirator with disease. A full-body soak, far from being invigorating, began to feel like a dangerous gamble, an open invitation for misfortune and suffering. You'd probably eye a tub of steaming water with a mix of longing and deep apprehension, a chilling thought that quickly extinguished any desire for a proper wash. Better to stay dry and safe, you'd reason, than risk inviting the Black Death into your very being. Unsurprisingly, public bathhouses, which had once been communal hubs for health and social interaction, began to acquire increasingly scandalous reputations. They became associated not just with physical exposure but with moral laxity, gambling, and even prostitution. Their steamy interiors, once places of relaxed conversation, now whispered of sin and indecency. The very idea of mixing with strangers in such a setting, especially with the fear of disease, became doubly unappealing, a moral and physical hazard. The Church, ever a powerful force in shaping medieval society, played a pivotal role in accelerating this transformation. Its teachings vigorously associated public bathing, especially mixed gender bathing, with sin and indecency. You would hear sermons condemning such practices, reinforcing the idea that nakedness, even for cleanliness, was an affront to God. This moral crusade led to the widespread closure or abandonment of bathhouses across much of Europe, effectively sealing their fate. What few remained were often viewed with suspicion, their patrons considered morally questionable. Consequently, staying dry was increasingly perceived as not only safer and healthier, a genuine if misguided attempt to avoid plague, but also holier and more modest. The act of being naked in hot water transformed into a moral transgression, practically inviting the devil in for a splash. You'd learn to avoid it not just for your health, but for your soul. Yet it's crucial to understand that despite their apprehension, medieval people were not simply lazy or ignorant. Their fear of bathing stemmed from a genuine, albeit deeply flawed, attempt to stay healthy, without germ theory, just paranoia than prevention. You'd be living this paranoia, feeling the chill of it in every decision about your personal care, constantly weighing perceived risks against the fleeting dream of freshness. This widespread apprehension fundamentally dictated the actual bathing practices available to you based on your social standing. Given the widespread apprehension towards full-body immersion, your bathing practices, like so many other aspects of medieval life, were fundamentally dictated by your social class and access to resources. This wasn't a matter of personal preference, but an ingrained reality of your station. If you were among the nobility, you could at least occasionally enjoy the supreme luxury of a proper bath. This required significant logistical effort, typically orchestrated by your servants. They would arrange for large wooden tubs, often lined with protective linen sheets to prevent splinters and add a touch of comfort to be brought into your private chambers. Then cauldrons of boiling water heated over a fire for hours would be carefully carried in and poured, creating a warm, secluded oasis. This was a rare, cherished event, transforming your chamber into a temporary sanctuary from the cold, damp world outside. You might sink into the water with a sigh, the warmth, a profound comfort to your oft-aching body. These noble baths were frequently enhanced, not necessarily for deep cleansing, but for masking the pervasive odors of medieval life. Servants would often add aromatic herbs like lavender, rosemary, or sage to the bath water, sometimes even rose petals. This transformed the experience into a sensory soup, creating a fragrant deception that enveloped you. It wasn't about scrubbing away grime so much as it was about perfuming your skin, leaving you with a delicate herbal scent that subtly, temporarily counteracted the underlying smells. You would emerge smelling fragrant, perhaps even feeling cleaner, but the true efficacy of such a bath by modern standards was limited. It was more about the perception of cleanliness and the enjoyment of sensory pleasure than true sanitation. Privacy during noble bathing, surprisingly, was often optional. Spouses sometimes shared tubs of peculiar intimacy that might to your modern sensibilities feel rather like medieval fondue, only less appetizing. The shared experience, however, could be a moment of quiet connection, a rare opportunity for uninhibited conversation away from the ever-present gaze of servants and courtiers. For peasants like you, bathing was a far more utilitarian and communal affair. The concept of a private chamber and specially heated water was utterly alien. Your bath would take place in rivers or streams during warmer months, the cold water, a bracing, almost painful shock to your system. Or perhaps in a large barrel or a basic outdoor pit filled with cold water drawn from a communal well. These were not solitary acts. Your bathing space was often shared with children, with laundry being scrubbed nearby, and sometimes even with livestock who might be drinking from the very same water source you were using. It was a pragmatic, often chilly necessity, a quick splash and rub down to remove the thickest layers of grime rather than a leisurely soak. During the harsh, unforgiving winters, the sheer struggle for survival meant that even these rudimentary bathing practices took a significant back seat. The energy and resources required to heat enough water for even a partial wash, or the sheer misery of stripping down in freezing temperatures meant it was simply not a priority. You would adopt a resigned strategy of simply pretending to be clean, through layered clothing, a silent agreement of shared sacrifice and understanding among your community. The outer layers of your garments would accumulate dirt and odors, but underneath, perhaps a shift was changed, offering a minimal sense of freshness. Yet some urban bathhouses, particularly in warmer southern Europe, did manage to survive the church's condemnations. These might offer steam rooms and herbal treatments, providing a different, perhaps less water-intensive approach to personal care. However, their reputation often remained tinged with social ambiguity, a place mildly judged, but tolerated for its practical benefits or exotic appeal. And for truly special occasions or moments of desperate hope, like after childbirth or during recovery from a plague, a proper bath, even if in tepid rosemary water, became a desperate ritual of welcome or cleansing. It underscored its rarity and profound significance. With full immersion often out of the question or fraught with fear, the common practice for daily upkeep shifted to what you might call the humble sponge bath. When full-body immersion became suspect, the humble sponge bath using linen cloths became the predominant form of personal hygiene, focusing on strategic areas of the body, wiping themselves down like they were trying to buff a stain off a very delicate chair. It was a delicate balance of effort and efficacy, designed for a world where cleanliness was more about managing appearances than achieving true sterility. These partial washes concentrated on what were considered the high-traffic areas of the body, your hands, which were constantly touching, working and eating, your face, the primary point of social interaction, your armpits, notorious for accumulating sweat and odour, and your feet, which bore the brunt of daily labour and often remained encased in heavy, ill-ventilated shoes. You would use cloths, perhaps a rough linen rag or a softer piece of fabric if you were lucky, soaked in warm water. Sometimes to add a sense of cleansing or to combat odours you might use vinegar or herbal infusions. This provided a brief localised sense of freshness, a temporary reprieve from the pervasive grime, but it was far from comprehensive. You'd feel a fleeting sense of improvement, but the underlying reality of your physical state remained. Crucially, linen undergarments, shirts for men and shifts for women were your primary defence against omnipresent dirt. These layers worn directly against the skin were designed to be absorbent, trapping sweat, grime and body oils. This meant that changing your shirt regularly, even if your outer tunic remained crusty and unwashed for weeks or months, was about as close to modern hygiene as you were going to get. The linen acted as a barrier protecting your outer, more expensive garments from direct contact with your body's effluvia, and also provided a layer that could be, with considerable effort, washed and bleached, offering a visible sign of attempted cleanliness. You'd feel the fresh linen against your skin as a minor luxury, a temporary comfort in a world of persistent discomfort. If you were among the wealthier, these careful dabbing rituals would be performed by your attendants. They would bring you basins of water, perhaps infused with more luxurious rose water, and assist you in the washing, all while pretending not to judge them. It was a delicate social performance, a silent understanding between master and servant, where the facade of cleanliness was maintained through the labour of others. You might feel a fleeting sense of embarrassment, but mostly you would accept it as your due, a privilege of your station. For peasants like you, the process was far more hands-on. You would boil water over a fire, a significant effort in itself, and then carefully ladle it out into bowls. You'd then perform the same partial washes, perhaps without the subtle judgment, but definitely with more draft. The flickering firelight would cast long shadows as you quickly rubbed down your skin, feeling the chill of the air on your exposed limbs. It was a quick, pragmatic routine, focusing on efficiency over comfort, designed to get the job done and return to the warmth of your layers as swiftly as possible. Monastic orders, with their structured routines and emphasis on spiritual discipline, often incorporated scheduled washing into their daily lives. For them, these acts were considered part of a broader spiritual purification and humility, a practice more spiritual than sanitary in its primary motivation, though physical cleanliness was a beneficial byproduct. You'd see them emerge from their designated washing areas, a quiet dignity in their simple, clean habits, a stark contrast to the common populace. The result of these widespread partial washes was always the same: a quick rub down, a whisper of moisture, and a renewed sense of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock, a temporary reprieve from pervasive odors and itching. And with this understanding, you move on to the next particular challenge, the management of your hair. If medieval hair had a motto, you'd probably find yourself muttering, "It would probably be flammable but fragrant." This sums up the reality of hair care in your time in frequent washing, often with harsh concoctions and a heavy reliance on cover-up scents to manage the inevitable. Your hair, whether long or short, was a constant challenge, a canvas for both perceived beauty and pervasive grime. You'd often use homebrewed concoctions for hair washing recipes that sounded like the first draft of a spell book, hinting at the experimental and often harsh nature of medieval beauty. Ingredients might include various plant ashes, animal fats, or unusual herbal extracts, all mixed with water to create something vaguely cleansing. There was no gentle pH-balanced shampoo here. Your scalp was destined for a more robust, sometimes painful experience. Lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat was a common choice for those who could afford or make it. It was incredibly effective at cutting through grease and dirt, but also notoriously harsh on the scalp. Imagine the sensation, a strong alkaline solution stripping your hair of all its natural oils, leaving it feeling rough and tangled, your scalp potentially irritated. Shampooing your hair often felt more like punishment than self-care, a necessary evil rather than a luxurious ritual. You'd brace yourself for the experience, knowing the discomfort was temporary but inevitable. For those seeking gentler, if equally peculiar alternatives, you might turn to egg yolks. This option, while less abrasive, was undeniably unappealing. You can picture it sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck. The cold, slimy texture, a thoroughly unpleasant sensation. While eggs might add some luster, the process itself was far from glamorous. Another option was beer rinses, which might leave your hair feeling somewhat softened, but would certainly make you smell like you'd had a wild night. The lingering scent of stale ale might be preferable to other odours, but it certainly wasn't the fresh, clean scent you might dream of. Herbal infusions, particularly vinegar with rosemary or lavender, were frequently used to mask existing odours. These weren't necessarily cleansers, but rather a targeted splash and squeeze operation, designed to create the illusion of freshness and care. You would pour or dab these fragrant liquids onto your hair, hoping the aromatic notes would temporarily overpower the underlying smells of stale sweat and smoke. It was a cosmetic fix, a way to present yourself as cared for, even if the deep cleansing was absent. Water temperature was a constant concern, entangled with medieval medical beliefs. Hot water was widely believed to weaken the brain, making you susceptible to illness and dulling your senses. Cold water, on the other hand, was thought to invite plague and other ailments, chilling your vital humours. This left lukewarm water as the ideal if hard to achieve compromise. Imagine the effort waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water to cool to just the right temperature, carefully testing it with your hand before committing to a wash, constantly balancing the perceived health risks. Despite the challenges of washing, brushing and combing were routine practices. Combs, often elaborately carved from bone wood or horn, were cherished personal items reflecting a rare moment of elegance in an otherwise itchy reality. Well-kept hair, even if infrequently washed, was a source of pride and a sign of personal discipline. You would carefully untangle knots, remove loose hairs, and perhaps even inspect your comb for unwelcome visitors. It was a small act of self-care, a way to maintain some semblance of order in a world that often felt chaotic, and it offered a brief respite as you considered the next frontier of personal care, your teeth. When it came to your dental hygiene in the medieval world, the focus was less sparkling smile and more "I still have most of my teeth." This pragmatic approach prioritised survival and functionality over aesthetics, a stark contrast to the gleaming smiles you see in modern advertisements. Losing teeth was an accepted if uncomfortable part of aging, or sometimes a swift consequence of a bad diet or infection. Linen rags were the primary tool for cleaning your teeth. You would take a piece of cloth, perhaps a spare scrap or a dedicated linen rag, and use it to rub your teeth clean. Sometimes these rags were soaked in abrasive substances to enhance their cleaning power. Imagine the sensation of rubbing your gums and teeth with salt, a sharp, stinging sensation. Or perhaps crushed mint, offering a fleeting sense of freshness amidst the grit. Burnt rosemary ash was another common additive, its fine, gritty texture meant to scour away debris. Toothbrushes as you know them today were centuries away from invention-making for a rough, gritty scrub that felt more like polishing stone than gently cleaning your mouth. Chewing sticks offered a slightly more advanced, albeit still rudimentary approach. These were typically frayed hazel or elm twigs chosen for their fibrous texture. After meals you would use these sticks as a biodegradable, if weirdly bark-flavoured precursor to the modern toothbrush. You'd chew on the end to splay the fibres, then use the brush-like end to scrub your teeth, dislodging food particles and gently stimulating your gums. It was a functional, readily available tool, a small effort to prevent the worst effects of food accumulation, but certainly not a comprehensive dental cleaning. To combat the inevitable bad breath, which was a constant companion in a world of rudimentary hygiene and coarse diets, you would chew potent spices. Fennel seeds with their aniseed flavour, or the warm, pungent notes of cloves and cardamom were common choices. These offered a temporary masking effect, an attempt to overpower the underlying odours. If you were in wealthier circles, you might have the luxury of rinsing your mouth with vinegar wine or even expensive myrrh water. This was a dental sophistication like gargling, a fluid also used to embalm pharaohs, a clear indicator of status and access to rare goods, offering a more thorough, if still incomplete, freshening effect. Early forms of toothpaste did exist, though they were a far cry from the minty gels you're familiar with. These were gritty pastes made from powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, or oyster shell ash, often mixed with honey or oil to bind them. The idea was to create an abrasive substance that would physically scour the teeth. You can imagine the feeling, a mouthful of gritty, dark paste designed to make your mouth feel sandblasted, if not cleaner. It was a harsh experience, but one believed to be beneficial, scraping away the visible plaque and leaving a temporary sensation of cleanliness. When dental problems became severe, dentists were typically barbers or blacksmiths, individuals accustomed to tools and a certain level of physical intervention. Their solution for infected or troublesome teeth was simple, brutal, and utterly devoid of modern comforts: immediate extraction. There was no anaesthetic save for perhaps a strong drink or a quick prayer. You'd find yourself in a wooden chair, probably in a less than sterile environment, facing a strong grip and a few whispered words to God before the painful yank. It was a terrifying prospect, a last resort that often left you with a gaping hole and a lingering fear of dental issues. Despite this rudimentary care, medieval people were not necessarily toothless. In a strange irony, lower sugar diets, particularly in rural populations, meant that some individuals, especially those who primarily ate grains and vegetables, had better dental health than many modern counterparts. However, when decay did occur, it was swift and severe, often leading to abscesses, infections, and early tooth loss. You understood that the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it was divine intervention, a fatalistic acceptance of the harsh realities of a life without modern medicine leading you inevitably to consider the omnipresent issue of body odour and masking techniques. If you could bottle the collective aroma of medieval Europe, you'd find it smelled committed to being unforgettable. This wasn't just a fleeting scent, it was a pervasive, inescapable combination of human sweat, animal odours, the tang of rotting food, and an underlying optimism, or perhaps a resigned acceptance, that lingered in the air of every bustling town and quiet village. Your nose by necessity adapted, but the sheer volume of competing smells was a constant assault. In a valiant, though often losing battle against this pervasive funk, you'd see and perhaps use pomanders. These were small, decorative hollow balls often made of precious metals like silver or gold for the elite, though simpler versions might be made of carved wood or fabric. They were filled with potent aromatic herbs, cloves, cinnamon, lavender, rosemary, or more exotic and expensive substances like musk or ambergris. Worn around the neck on a chain tucked into clothing or even held to the nose, a pomander was like a medieval Glade plug-in, a portable attempt to politely overpower the filth. You'd carry this small orb, a fragrant personal shield, hoping it created a tiny bubble of pleasant scent around you, even if it couldn't truly erase the larger olfactory reality. Scented sachets, little bags filled with dried herbs, were another popular method, particularly for noble women. These would be tucked into bodices, sewn into sleeves, or even braided into hair. They served as personal portable odour masks, combining hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. The fragrant herbs were believed to ward off evil spirits and disease, as well as providing a pleasant scent. You might discreetly adjust a sachet, feeling the soft rustle of dried petals against your skin, hoping its subtle perfume made you more agreeable to those around you. Imported perfumes often derive from rose oil civet, a glandular secretion from a small cat-like animal, or other precious botanicals were the ultimate luxury for the elite. These were not for commoners. Their cost made them accessible only to the very wealthy. Dabs of these precious liquids applied sparingly served as a visible sign of status, a clear indicator of immense privilege. More than that, they were a desperate attempt to defy the pervasive stench, a fragrant declaration of superiority in a world full of unpleasant smells. You'd catch a fleeting whiff of rose or musk from a passing lady of the court, a stark contrast to the everyday odours, pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips and regret. Beyond personal efforts, the environmental smells of medieval cities were overwhelming. Open sewers, if they existed at all, flowed freely in the streets. Livestock, pigs and other animals roamed, leaving their waste wherever they pleased. Candle smoke and the fumes from countless hearths added a layer of acridity. And whatever the local butcher or fishmonger flung into the street simply joined the general miasma. Cities were truly enveloped in a fog of funk, a constant, unavoidable assault on your nose, a sensory experience that no single pomander could truly overcome. You'd learn to simply breathe through your mouth when navigating particularly pungent areas, an unspoken survival tactic. Deodorant, as you understand it, wasn't real, but shared suffering absolutely was. Everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight, creating an identity of collective body odour. It was a common universal experience that transcended social barriers, a strange equaliser in a hierarchical society. You knew that everyone else smelled, and you knew that you smelled too, creating a baseline of acceptance. Attempts at rudimentary antiperspirants or odour neutralisers included alum powder chalk or vinegar rinses. You might try rubbing a bit of alum under your arms, hoping it would dry the sweat and reduce the smell, aiming to smell like a salad, rather than medieval stew meat, assuming you remembered to grind rocks into your pits. It was a messy, imperfect solution, but an effort nonetheless. And perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, not just as fashion accessories, but mostly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets, a small personal shield against the overwhelming public effluvia. With such a constant battle against odours, you would inevitably find yourself constantly playing host to other smaller, less fragrant but far more irritating inhabitants' pests. Beyond the pervasive odours and the challenge of personal cleansing, you were also constantly engaged in another more intimate battle, the ceaseless war against pest infestation. Make no mistake, medieval people were constantly playing host to an entire travelling circus of lice, fleas and mites. These weren't merely an inconvenience. They were unwanted roommates that everyone had, from the richest lord to the poorest peasant, the true equalizers of medieval society. You might try to ignore them, but the constant itching was a persistent, undeniable reminder of their presence. Head lice in particular were an inescapable part of life. You'd see people young and old scratching their scalps with a familiar, almost unconscious gesture. To combat these persistent parasites, lice combs were common personal items. These were often made of bone or wood with incredibly fine, closely packed teeth, designed to physically scrape out insects and nits from hair, like some kind of tiny screaming orchard. You'd sit patiently as a family member or a servant if you were noble, painstakingly work through your hair, the rhythmic scrape of the comb a familiar sound. It was a tedious, often painful process, but a necessary one to alleviate the incessant itching and prevent truly overwhelming infestations. When infestations became severe or simply as a preventative measure, more drastic methods were employed. Boiling clothes was a common technique to kill lice and their eggs, a desperate measure that risked damaging valuable garments as it wasn't laundry day, it was pest execution. Imagine the care required to boil a wool tunic without shrinking or ruining it all, while knowing you were literally cooking out the unwanted inhabitants. Baking clothes near a fire or in an oven was another method relying on dry heat to eradicate the vermin. These were not casual tasks. They were intensive, time-consuming interventions in your constant battle against these tiny adversaries. For those truly desperate, or as a practice among certain groups, head shaving offered a drastic but remarkably effective solution. By removing the vermin's habitat, you could achieve a temporary, almost complete eradication of lice. Monks, for instance, often shaved their heads as part of their spiritual discipline, inadvertently benefiting from this hygienic side effect. However, the irony was not lost on you. While shaving might clear your natural hair a wig, if you were wealthy enough to wear one could quickly become its own lice hotel, providing a new cosy home for the resilient parasites. Fleas were another ubiquitous problem, especially for those sleeping in straw mattresses, which provided ideal breeding grounds, or for anyone living in close proximity to animals. The constant jumping and biting of fleas were a particular torment. To manage them, you might try smoke fumigation, burning specific herbs or substances to drive them out. Herbal sachets filled with plants like tansy or wormwood were placed in bedding or among clothes, hoping their strong scents would deter the pests, hoping the pests moved on to someone smellier. It was a constant low-level skirmish, a game of hide-and-seek with microscopic enemies. The constant pervasive itching and scratching, whether from lice, fleas, or simply general skin irritation from unwashed clothing and harsh environmental conditions, were an inescapable part of daily life. It was like Tax's death, or stepping in something unspeakable near the market stalls, a universal tactile discomfort that everyone experienced. You would often see people unconsciously scratch an arm or adjust their clothing, a shared silent acknowledgement of the never-ending battle against these tiny creatures. This constant state of irritation was a fundamental layer of your medieval sensory experience, shaping your comfort, your sleep, and your very interactions, and it inevitably brought you to the grim reality of waste disposal. The term medieval toilet might strike you as a wildly optimistic description, for in your reality going to the bathroom was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation and lowered expectations. There were no porcelain thrones, no flushing mechanisms, and certainly no pleasant-smelling air fresheners. Your daily elimination was a crude, often public affair dictated by necessity and whatever rudimentary solutions were available. If you were fortunate enough to live in a castle, you would have access to a garderobe. These were essentially closets typically located high up in the castle walls, often within a tower. Inside you'd find a stone bench with a hole in it, which dropped straight down into the moat below or into a specially constructed cesspit at the base of the castle. The location high in the towers provided a semblance of privacy, though you quickly learned not to loiter directly below, especially on a windy day. The constant airflow, while drafty, did offer a primitive form of ventilation attempting to carry odours away. Still, the reality of your waste simply falling freely into the environment below was a stark reminder of the basic nature of sanitation. For peasants like you, such luxuries were unimaginable. You had fewer options and certainly no constructed facilities. Most often, you would do your business outside in the nearest woods by a river or stream, contributing to water contamination, or simply behind a barn or a thicket of bushes. Some villages, particularly larger ones, might have communal pits. These were designated areas where everyone relieved themselves, characterized by very low standards and even lower privacy. You might find yourself squatting beside a neighbour, perhaps engaging in a casual discussion about crop yields or the weather mid-squat, a peculiar intimacy born of necessity. It was a completely unglamorous, often chilly and deeply unprivate experience. Chamber pots were an indispensable item in almost every household, regardless of status, particularly for nighttime use. These ceramic or wooden vessels were tucked under beds ready for use when the thought of venturing outside in the dark and cold was simply too unappealing or dangerous. The contents of these pots, however, had to go somewhere, and that somewhere all too frequently was directly into the streets below. You'd hear or perhaps shout yourself a warning of "Guard low, watch out for the water," before emptying the contents out of an upper window. The accuracy of this warning was not guaranteed, and unsuspecting passers-by often bore the brunt of this crude disposal method. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a significant contributor to the unsanitary conditions of medieval urban environments. Street sanitation, or the lack thereof, was a pervasive problem. Waste disposal was handled mostly by gravity and foraging animals like pigs, who would root through the refuse. Some urban areas had rudimentary gutters or central ditches, but these often clogged quickly, especially after rain, and fermented into a neighbourhood feature, a perpetually reeking, stagnant channel of effluent. These open sewers and overflowing ditches were a constant assault on your senses, a visible and olfactory testament to the complete absence of modern waste management. And then there was the question of toilet paper. The concept simply did not exist. You would use whatever was at hand and readily available. Rags, moss, straw wool scraps, or even snow in winter were common choices, and in desperate situations, or for those who simply had no other option, your hands might be used to be washed or simply wiped afterwards. These reflected the harsh, uncomfortable realities of personal hygiene, making for truly unpleasant choices, a constant, gritty reminder of your basic, unglamorous existence. This fundamental challenge of waste management intertwined with your other daily duties, particularly the physical demands of medieval labour. Beyond the immediate struggles of keeping yourself presentable, the very fabric of your daily life, the labour you performed and the responsibilities you carried, continuously presented new challenges to any semblance of cleanliness. The strenuous physical demands of agricultural and craft labour were simply inescapable. Whether you were tilling fields, tending livestock, working at a forge, or weaving cloth, your body was in constant motion, exerting itself. This inevitably led to constant sweat, accumulated grime, and a pervasive body odour that became a hallmark of your working life. Personal cleanliness in this context was truly a secondary concern to the necessity of work, a constant, unrelenting cycle of toil that left little time or energy for fastidiousness. As a worker, particularly a peasant, you were consistently exposed to unhygienic environments. Your hands, often bare, were plunged into soil that might harbour pathogens, or came into contact with animal waste. The fields where you toiled, the workshops where you crafted, and the streets you traversed were all rife with potential contaminants. This constant exposure contributed directly to higher rates of illness and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. You might experience frequent skin infections, respiratory ailments from dusty environments, or persistent digestive issues, all exacerbated by the lack of modern sanitation and medical understanding. This wasn't just abstract risk, it was a daily tangible threat to your well-being. The clothing you wore essential for protection against the elements added another layer of discomfort and hygiene challenge. Heavy layered garments, often made of wool or coarse linen, were required to shield you from sun, wind and cold. While practical, these layers trapped heat and moisture close to your body, exacerbating discomfort, promoting skin conditions and intensifying the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies. Your clothing effectively became a mobile greenhouse of funk holding onto every scent and stain. You'd feel the rough fabric chafing against your skin, damp with sweat, accumulating the dust and dirt of your labour. The time and effort involved in even rudimentary hygiene practices had to be carefully weighed against the immediate pressing demands of survival and your daily duties. Heating water, for instance, was not a trivial task. It required gathering fuel, tending a fire, and waiting for the water to warm all precious time that could be spent on more essential activities like farming, cooking, or mending tools. Doing laundry, a particularly arduous task, also consumed vast amounts of time and energy. Your life was a constant prioritization of basic needs over comfort, and often cleanliness was relegated to a distant third or fourth place on that list. For women, the labour of managing household hygiene was a particularly significant part of their daily burden. This included the physically demanding process of washing clothes. Imagine hauling heavy baskets of soiled garments to a nearby river or stream, even in chilly weather. There you'd apply lye soap, a harsh caustic substance, and then beat the clothes on rocks or scrub them vigorously by hand. It was a grueling and chilly task requiring immense physical strength and endurance, often leaving your hands raw and chapped. This was not a quick trip to the laundromat. It was an all-day affair, a testament to the sheer effort required to maintain even a basic level of cleanliness for your family. Soldiers and travellers faced extreme hygiene challenges, often enduring prolonged exposure to harsh conditions, a complete lack of proper facilities and constant physical exertion. Imagine marching for days or weeks in the same sweat-soaked, mud-caked clothing with no opportunity to wash. This often resulted in severe pest infestations from lice to scabies and a high incidence of illness. Battlefields, encampments, and long journeys were breeding grounds for disease and discomfort, a never-ending battle against the elements and microscopic enemies that further stripped away any illusions of personal cleanliness. You'd see comrades succumb not to swords but to dysentery, a stark reminder of hygiene's deadly importance. The pervasive nature of these challenges extended even to the youngest members of society, shaping childhood and education in profound ways. As a child in the medieval world, your hygiene practices closely mirrored those of the adults around you. There was no special treatment or gentler approach for the young. You simply participated in the same rudimentary washing routines and experienced the same relentless challenges regarding pests and odors from a very early age. Your childhood was not one of bubble baths and fresh scents, but of pragmatic, often uncomfortable lessons in managing a dirty world. You learned quickly that the world was not a clean place, and you were a part of it. Indeed, high rates of childhood illness and mortality were an unfortunate and pervasive reality. These were directly linked to the widespread poor sanitation, the constant battle against pest infestations, and most fundamentally, the complete lack of understanding of germ theory. Children were particularly vulnerable, their developing immune systems constantly battling infections from contaminated water food and the sheer volume of bacteria and parasites in their environment. This made childhood a precarious existence, a time when even a simple cut could turn deadly, and a common cold could escalate into something far more serious. You'd see children sicken and sometimes fade, a constant quiet tragedy that underscored the fragility of life. From a remarkably young age, you were involved in basic chores that implicitly taught you methods of cleanliness. Fetching water from the communal well or river, a heavy and often cold task, was one such chore. Assisting with laundry, which involved hauling, scrubbing and beating clothes, was another. Through these necessary duties, you learned practical, albeit basic, hygiene methods out of necessity rather than formal instruction. You observed your parents and elders replicating their actions, understanding that these tasks were essential for the family's survival and relative comfort. There was no school curriculum for hygiene. It was a hand-me-down of tradition passed from one generation to the next. Education regarding personal cleanliness was thus largely informal and familial. It was transmitted through observation custom and the constant repetition of daily tasks. The emphasis was always on utility, what needed to be done to manage the most immediate and pressing problems, rather than on a scientific understanding of health. You learned that filth led to sickness, but the how and why were shrouded in superstition and folk remedies, not germ theory. You simply accepted that certain actions like changing a linen shift or vigorously combing your hair offered a small measure of protection, a quiet act of defiance against the ever-present threats. Constant exposure to unsanitary environments from infancy fostered a certain resilience among survivors. Your body, if it made it past the perilous early years, developed immunities to many common pathogens. However, this resilience came at a cost. It also ensured a lifelong susceptibility to various endemic diseases. You might become accustomed to frequent stomach upsets or recurring skin conditions, viewing them as normal aspects of life. This was a quiet endurance, a body constantly working to fight off invaders, a testament to the harsh conditions in which you grew up. The sounds and sensations of medieval childhood were deeply intertwined with these hygiene realities. The splashing of water in a shared communal bath, often a chilly, quick affair, was a familiar sound. The rhythmic scrape of a lice comb through your hair or your siblings was another. These weren't just background noises. They were early formative sensory experiences that defined your medieval childhood, weaving discomfort and the constant battle against pests into the very fabric of your memory. This intimate understanding of cleanliness or its absence profoundly shaped the broader social fabric, including communication and etiquette. Beyond the tangible struggles of daily cleanliness, the scratch of lice, the pervasive odors, the chilly baths, you begin to understand that an invisible yet immensely powerful force shapes your medieval existence, the social fabric of culture, etiquette, and relationships. How people perceived and performed hygiene, or the lack thereof, profoundly defined their interactions, and even their inner worlds. This wasn't just about what you smelled like. It was about what that smell communicated. The pervasive presence of body odor and environmental smells created a shared multisensory backdrop to all social interactions. You couldn't escape it, and neither could anyone else. This shared olfactory experience subtly influenced acceptable personal distances and conversational norms. You wouldn't typically lean in too close for a casual chat as modern people might. A certain physical distance was implicitly maintained, a respectful boundary against the inevitable sensory realities. You learn to read the nuances of these interactions, recognizing that a slightly greater distance might not be an insult but a practical consideration. Perhaps one of the most potent nonverbal indicators of your social standing, discipline, and even moral character was your appearance, especially the relative cleanliness and whiteness of your linen undergarments. While your outer clothing might be soiled and worn from daily labour, a clean, bright linen shirt or shift worn directly against the skin was a powerful statement. It suggested that you had the resources or the diligence to acquire clean linen and the means to wash it. This was a subtle language of fabric, speaking volumes about you before you even uttered a word. You knew that a crisp white shift could for a moment elevate your perceived status, even if your true circumstances were humble. The use of pomanders and perfumes, particularly among the elite, functioned as a sophisticated form of social communication. For the wealthy, wearing a pomander filled with exotic spices or dabbed with expensive imported perfume wasn't just about masking odours. It was a clear signal of refinement status, and an attempt to differentiate oneself from the general funk of the common populace. It was a fragrant barrier, a way of asserting a different, more perfumed reality, in a world accustomed to less pleasant smells. You'd recognise the scent of rose or musk on a noble, a subtle yet powerful indication of their elevated position. Navigating crowded medieval spaces, a bustling market, a busy street, a packed church, required a practiced tolerance for strong odours. Your nose, initially overwhelmed, quickly developed an unspoken etiquette of selective sensory processing. You learned to filter out the most offensive smells, focusing instead on the visual or auditory aspects of your interaction, maintaining polite conversation despite the pervasive fog of funk. It was a daily negotiation with the nose, a mental trick to maintain social harmony in a less than fragrant world. Offering clean garments or scented water for hand washing to guests was a significant gesture of hospitality, underscoring the social value placed on efforts towards cleanliness, however basic. If you were a guest and offered a basin of warm, perhaps even perfumed water to wash your hands before a meal, you understood the profound welcome and respect implied. It was a tangible act of kindness, a recognition of the collective struggle against dirt and disease, and a desire to offer a moment of rare comfort. This simple gesture spoke volumes about the host's generosity and status. Paradoxically, the collective experience of shared odours fostered a sense of communal suffering, which in a paradoxical way contributed to a baseline of social acceptance, where only extreme neglect was truly noteworthy. You wouldn't openly judge someone for a faint body odour, for you knew your own might be similar. It was a shared humanity, a silent acknowledgement of the harsh realities that bound you all together, creating a unique social contract where certain smells were simply part of the package. This shared understanding also extended to the cultural performances of cleanliness that played out daily. Beyond the subtle cues of daily interaction, medieval society had its own unique cultural performances of cleanliness, specific actions that served as powerful social signals, communicating much more than just a lack of dirt. These weren't necessarily about being genuinely clean by modern standards, but about projecting an image of self-respect and adherence to social norms. You instinctively understood these signals, both in your own actions and in observing others. The regular changing of linen undergarments, even if worn beneath soiled outer layers, was a critical and often visible performance of personal self-respect. As you've learned, these inner layers absorbed sweat and grime. To have a fresh laundered shirt or shift was a testament to either your household's diligence if you were a commoner, labouring over a washboard, or your wealth if you employed servants to manage your extensive wardrobe. It was a powerful non-verbal declaration that you or your household were striving for a basic level of social hygiene, even if your outer tunic still bore the stains of your daily grind. You might feel a quiet sense of pride slipping into a newly laundered shift, knowing it made a difference in how you presented yourself. Wearing a perceptibly clean and bright linen shirt or shift, especially when seen in public or at social gatherings, functioned as a powerful social cue. It wasn't just about personal comfort. It communicated your virtue, your diligence, and even a degree of economic stability to the community. A truly pristine white shirt, unblemished and neatly pressed, a rare feat suggested you had the means to afford multiple garments, and the time or labour to keep them clean. It was a subtle yet effective way of communicating your standing without uttering a single word. You learned to observe these details on others, making unspoken judgments and adjustments to your own social interactions based on these visual cues. For the elite, the display and use of luxury items directly related to personal scent became a performative act of distinguishing their status. Wearing imported perfumes dabbed on sparingly, or carrying an elaborately crafted pomander wasn't just about smelling better. It was about asserting a superior, if still relative, level of cleanliness and refinement that was entirely out of reach for the common folk. These were visible markers of immense wealth and power, asserting a delicate, fragrant barrier between the nobility and the funk of the masses. You'd observe a lord or lady with their pomander, noting the subtle waft of expensive scent, understanding it as a declaration of their elevated place in the hierarchy. Even simple acts like carefully combing one's hair with an elaborately carved comb made of bone or horn could be interpreted as a subtle performance of personal discipline and a commitment to one's appearance. While washing might be infrequent, the act of maintaining neat, untangled hair free of visible pests showed an attention to detail and a respect for one's own body. It was a small daily ritual that projected an image of order and self-care even in a world where true hygiene was a constant uphill battle. You might spend a moment longer with your comb, consciously creating a parting, knowing it presented a better face to the world. The communal acceptance of a certain level of body odour meant that blending in with the prevailing scentscape was in itself a default social performance. You didn't necessarily strive to smell entirely different from everyone else. Rather, you tried to avoid being noticeably worse. While exceptional foulness could certainly invite social judgment and ostracism, the general shared experience of a baseline level of fragrance created a communal understanding. To smell like everyone else was in a way to conform to be a part of the accepted social order. It was a delicate balance, stand out too much positively or negatively, and you risked drawing unwanted attention. This subtle performance shaped your daily interactions, reminding you that in the medieval world even your smell had a social role to play. These cultural performances were themselves deeply influenced by the spiritual and superstitious beliefs of the era. Beyond the visible and sensory performances of cleanliness, your understanding and practice of hygiene were profoundly shaped by the pervasive spiritual frameworks and superstitions of the medieval world. This wasn't just about what felt right, it was about what was believed to be right for your soul and your health, often with dire consequences if you deviated. The widespread medical superstition that hot water opened pores to disease deeply intertwined hygiene practices with a pervasive, almost existential fear of illness. This wasn't merely a quaint belief, it was a powerful driving force that influenced decisions about bathing for centuries. You would internalize this fear. The comforting warmth of a bath which you might crave after a long cold day was transformed into a dangerous gateway, an invitation for the unseen forces of sickness to enter your body. This cultural narrative effectively turned what you consider a basic act of cleansing into a perilous ritual, something to be avoided for your very survival. The church, as the dominant moral and spiritual authority of your era, played an immense role in shaping these hygiene norms. Its influence was felt keenly in its vigorous condemnation of public bathhouses, particularly those where mixed genders gathered. These establishments were not just viewed as places of physical cleansing, they were associated with sin, moral corruption, and indecency. Sermons would preach against them, artists would depict them as dens of iniquity, and gradually the public perception shifted. The church's pronouncements led directly to their decline and closure, effectively removing one of the few avenues for communal bathing. You'd hear the warnings, feeling the weight of religious doctrine press upon your personal choices, making you question any desire for a public wash. Modesty and the pursuit of spiritual purity were often emphasized above physical cleanliness, implicitly or explicitly advocating for dry cleaning methods and partial washes as more virtuous than full body immersion. The idea was that spiritual purity, cleanliness of the soul was paramount, and often extensive physical indulgence, like a luxurious bath, was seen as a distraction or even an impediment to that spiritual goal. You were encouraged to focus on inner virtue, and the discomfort of a less than clean body might even be seen as a form of penance or humility. Nakedness, even in private, carried a moral weight, making full immersion a potentially scandalous act in your own mind. Monastic orders, while sometimes maintaining regular washing routines, often frame these acts not as simple physical hygiene but as spiritual disciplines. For a monk, washing might be intended for purification before prayer, or as an act of humility and self-denial. It was a practice more spiritual than sanitary in its core motivation. You might observe monks with their shaved heads and simple clean habits, understanding that their cleanliness was bound up with their vows and their spiritual journey, a different kind of motivation than simply wanting to feel fresh. Adding to this complex tapestry of beliefs was the prevailing medical notion that sweating was a healthy process essential for purging bad humours from the body. This meant that body odour, far from being a sign of poor hygiene, was sometimes tolerated or even justified as a natural and beneficial bodily function. You might even find a certain acceptance, or at least a lack of self-consciousness about your own scent, understanding it as a sign that your body was properly regulating itself, expelling what needed to be expelled. This medical theory inadvertently contributed to the pervasive, medically fragrant reality of your world. Ultimately, the concept of spiritual cleanliness, encouraged by religious authorities, often overshadowed, or was even seen as a substitute for rigorous physical hygiene. You were taught that a clean soul was more important than a clean body, and that excessive concern for physical comforts could lead you astray. This created a profound dichotomy, a world where your physical state was often at odds with your spiritual aspirations. Yet ritualistic uses of water for baptism or blessing, distinct from daily washing, highlight the profound spiritual significance placed on certain forms of water-based cleanliness, separate from practical hygiene. These were moments when water was not feared but revered, a conduit for grace rather than a carrier of disease, a stark contrast that revealed the deeply complex relationship medieval people had with the element of water. And these deeply ingrained beliefs profoundly shaped the most intimate corners of life, love, marriage, and family. Within this challenging macro-reality of hygiene, where fear, superstition, and rudimentary adaptations dictated so much, you find yourself contemplating the most intimate of human connections, love, marriage, and family life. The ubiquitous presence of body odour and basic hygiene conditions would have fundamentally shaped the sensory realities of these relationships, subtly yet profoundly influencing perceptions of attraction and closeness. Modern ideals of a fresh-scented partner were simply not a reality. Intimacy was found amidst a tapestry of natural, sometimes pungent human smells. Imagine the sensory landscape of your deepest relationships, the scent of your spouse, your children, your parents. It would be a complex blend of wood smoke, sweat, the foods you ate, and the subtle, unique aroma of unwashed skin and hair. This wasn't necessarily repulsive, it was simply normal. Attraction would have been based on other qualities, perhaps a strong work ethic, kindness, or social standing, rather than the elusive ideal of a pristine physical scent. You would grow accustomed to perhaps even find comfort in these familiar, deeply personal smells, understanding them as an integral part of who someone was. Marriage, often a pragmatic alliance formed for economic stability, social advantage, or the continuation of a lineage, would have implicitly factored in the reality of shared uncleanliness. The expectation of a partner who smelled perpetually fresh would have been absurd. Instead, personal fastidiousness, if it existed at all, would have been less of a romantic ideal and more of a practical consideration. Perhaps a partner who was diligent about changing their linen shift, or who didn't neglect the partial washes entirely. You would share a bed, a home, and a life with someone whose physical reality was much like your own, making any strong judgment of their personal odour somewhat hypocritical. Women, as the primary caretakers of the household, likely faced particular pressure to maintain a certain, albeit rudimentary, level of cleanliness for their children and their home. This wasn't just about their own personal appearance, but about the health and well-being of their family, however limited their understanding of hygiene might be. The labour of washing clothes, fetching water and managing waste often fell disproportionately on them, impacting their daily domestic duties and adding another layer of physical burden. You would see women constantly working their hands chapped from lye soap and cold water, striving to keep some order in a perpetually challenging environment. The profound lack of private bathing facilities within most homes meant that personal care routines were often communal or done in highly visible spaces. Whether it was a quick wash by the hearth or a shared barrel bath, individual agency and hygiene was severely limited. You rarely had the luxury of a truly private moment for self-care. This constant exposure meant that your family members were intimately familiar with your hygiene efforts, or lack thereof. This shared vulnerability, however, could also foster a unique kind of bond, a collective understanding of the challenges of maintaining basic cleanliness. Perhaps one of the most unexpected forms of familial bonding came from the shared experience of coping with pests like lice and fleas. These were not just individual annoyances, they were household problems. Parents and children often engaged in communal combing rituals, meticulously picking lice from each other's hair. This wasn't glamorous, but it was a quiet shared struggle, a moment of close physical contact and mutual care born of necessity. You would sit still as your mother or sibling worked through your hair, the rhythmic scrape of the comb, a familiar comforting sound even amidst the discomfort of the pests. It was a tangible expression of family interdependence, a silent agreement to help each other navigate the pervasive annoyances of medieval life. This shared familial identity in turn fed into the larger weight of clan identity within the community. As you navigate the intricate web of medieval life, you begin to grasp that your personal cleanliness and that of your immediate family isn't just a private matter. It carries significant weight of clan identity, directly influencing your family's reputation within the community and dictating how others perceive and interact with you. In a tightly knit society where everyone knew everyone else's business appearances, however humble, mattered deeply. The collective cleanliness of a household, particularly the visible state of its linen and the general order of its living space, directly contributed to the family's standing. If your family was known for having relatively clean shifts, even if they were patched, and a home that, while basic, was not overtly squalid, it reflected well on you all. It spoke to diligence, responsibility, and a certain level of self-respect. These weren't just aesthetic judgments, they were moral ones. A well-kept home, however modest, suggested a disciplined and virtuous family unit. You understood that these subtle cues were constantly being observed and evaluated by your neighbours, shaping their opinions of your lineage. Conversely, a family perceived as openly neglecting basic hygiene might face social ostracism or subtle forms of community disapproval. If your clothes were perpetually crusted with dirt, if your home was a known haven for vermin, or if your family's collective odour was particularly strong, it could impact your standing and broader social interactions. Neighbours might be less likely to offer help to trade goods or to consider your children for marriage. It was a silent but potent form of social sanction, affecting not just the individual but the entire family unit. You'd feel the subtle coldness, the averted gazes, understanding that your family's perceived lack of hygiene had created a barrier. The communal nature of many hygiene facilities further amplified this public scrutiny. Village pits for waste disposal shared water sources like wells and rivers, and even the public streets where chamber pot contents were emptied meant that individual and family cleanliness was under constant public observation and judgment. There was no hiding your habits. If your family consistently used the dirtiest parts of the river for washing, or if your chamber pot empties were particularly egregious, the entire community would notice. This constant visibility meant that personal actions had communal consequences, reflecting directly back on your clan. Any scandal related to unhygienic practices or illicit activities occurring in the few remaining bathhouses, which as you know often acquired unsavoury reputations, would have reflected poorly not just on the individuals involved, but potentially on their entire lineage. If a family member was caught in a scandalous situation in a bathhouse, or known for particularly foul habits, the stain on their reputation could extend to their parents, siblings, and even their children. The medieval world was a small world, and reputation once tarnished was incredibly difficult to restore. You understood the gravity of such an association, knowing that your individual actions carried the weight of your family name. Yet despite these judgments, the shared experience of collective body odour meant that a certain level of fragrance was a common familial trait. It was an accepted reality contrasting sharply with the severe social judgment reserved for extreme filth. You might recognise the subtle, unique scent of your own family members, a blend of their particular habits, diet and environment, and it would be a familiar, even comforting identifier. It was a strange paradox. A certain degree of shared human smell was universally accepted, a bond of common humanity, but to cross the line into genuine squalor was to invite social ruin. This delicate balance of acceptance and judgment shaped your daily interactions, reminding you that your identity was deeply intertwined with that of your clan, even down to the very air you carried. Ultimately, these intricate cultural nuances rested upon the foundational realities of medieval society. As you delve deeper into the complex tapestry of medieval life, you find that beneath all the cultural nuances, the personal struggles and the social mandates, the foundational realities of the society itself impose universal constraints that make even basic hygiene a profound challenge. This isn't just about individual choice. It's about an overarching structure that dictates what is possible, what is difficult, and what is utterly out of reach for you. At the very top of these foundational realities is the inescapable social hierarchy. Your hygiene practices are without exception fundamentally stratified by your social class. This directly correlates with your access to essential resources such as clean water, the precious fuel needed for heating private spaces free from prying eyes, and most importantly the labour of servants to manage the logistics of daily life. This rigid class structure creates stark disparities in almost every aspect of existence, and particularly in how clean or comfortable you can realistically be. You immediately recognise your place within this system, understanding that your circumstances are largely predetermined. If you are born into a noble household, you command the resources necessary to navigate the challenges of medieval hygiene with relative ease. You have the wealth to afford the prodigious amounts of wood or charcoal needed to heat water for a bath, even if infrequent. You possess private chambers where these baths can be taken, offering a rare sanctuary from public gaze. Crucially, you have access to a subservient class, servants, maids and pages, whose labour manages all the logistics, fetching water, heating it in massive cauldrons, filling tubs and later emptying them. This is not just a luxury, it is a silent, constant display of power, a tangible manifestation of your elevated status, allowing you a level of comfort and perceived cleanliness unimaginable to the vast majority. For you as a peasant, the stark contrast is immediate and often harsh. You utterly lack these amenities. There are no private chambers for bathing, no servants to fetch and heat your water. You're forced to rely on communal bodies of water such as rivers, streams, or village wells for all your needs. Or at best, basic outdoor facilities like communal pits. This underscores the profound inequality in daily living standards. Your persistent discomfort is a direct consequence of your position at the bottom of the social ladder. You learn to accept these conditions, knowing that aspiring for noble luxuries is a fool's errand. Monastic communities, standing somewhat apart from the strict lay hierarchy, often maintained more rigorous, albeit spiritually focused hygiene standards than the general populace. Their structured way of life, with established rules and communal resources, allowed for dedicated washing routines. While still basic by modern standards, these routines often surpassed what was available to a common villager. You might observe monks with a certain reverence, noting their relative cleanliness, understanding it as part of their disciplined otherworldly existence, a quiet testament to their devotion. Perhaps one of the most immediate and visible social markers, however, was the relative cleanliness of one's linen garments. While the outer tunic of a peasant might be worn and soiled, the whiteness and apparent freshness of the linen shirt or shift underneath spoke volumes. It indicated wealth, the ability to own multiple linens and have them washed, and status, and perhaps even moral standing, suggesting a diligent and respectable person. It was a subtle language of fabric, a non-verbal cue that could influence how you were perceived and treated. You quickly learned to judge others, and to present yourself by the state of your linen. Despite this rigid social stratification, the pervasive nature of body odour and environmental smells created a curious commonality. The fog of funk enveloped everyone from commoner to king. This shared sensory reality transcended some class divisions, creating a strange silent acknowledgement of shared human struggle, connecting this to the core economy and resource management that determined access to even basic cleanliness. Hand in hand with the inescapable social hierarchy or medieval existence is profoundly shaped by the core economy and resource management of the age. This isn't just about money, it's about the fundamental availability or lack thereof of the very elements that facilitate even rudimentary hygiene. Every effort you make towards cleanliness is weighed against the scarcity and cost of essential resources. Access to clean potable water, for instance, is a persistent and often life-threatening challenge. You primarily rely on communal wells, rivers, or streams. The tragic reality is that these very sources are also frequently used for waste disposal, not just by humans, but by livestock. Imagine collecting your drinking water from a river, where just upstream animals are watering, and downstream someone is emptying their chamber pot. This poses a fundamental health risk to the entire population. Every glass of water you drink, every bucket you fetch for washing, carries potential for waterborne illnesses. Personal cleanliness becomes a calculated risk, a gamble against invisible threats that you simply don't have the scientific knowledge to comprehend. You learn to boil water for cooking if fuel is available, but for washing cold, untreated water is often your only option. The cost and availability of fuel, typically wood or peat, directly dictates the feasibility of heating water. For most, a hot bath or even a basin of warm water for a partial wash is a rare luxury rather than a daily convenience. Imagine the hours of labour required to gather enough firewood, the cost if you have to buy it, and the time spent stoking a fire large enough to heat several cauldrons of water. This is a clear economic barrier to comfort and cleanliness. Only the wealthy can consistently afford the fuel and the labour to make heated water a regular part of their routine. For you, warmth and cleanliness are often mutually exclusive aspirations, a choice between a hot meal and a warm wash. Basic soap, a utility you might take for granted, exists in a very different form in your era. Primarily produced from animal fat and lye derived from wood ash, it's a harsh, abrasive substance. Its main use is for laundry, where its strong alkaline properties are effective at cutting through grime on fabrics. For personal use, it's often too irritating for the skin, causing dryness, redness, and itching. This reflects an economy focused on practical necessities and durability over personal comfort and gentle skin care. You might use it sparingly on your hands, feeling the sting, but for your body it's rarely an option. Luxury soaps, such as imported Castile soap made from olive oil, are exotic and exceptionally expensive trade goods. Accessible only to the very wealthy, they serve as a clear indicator of economic privilege. To own a bar of such soap with its milder lather and perhaps delicate scent is a sign of immense status, a sensory indulgence that most can only dream of. The scent of such a soap would be rare, a fleeting whiff of distant lands, and high status, a stark contrast to the animal fat lye soap you might use for your coarse linen. The predominantly agrarian economy means that daily life and labour are inherently physically demanding, and by their very nature dirty. Your days are spent toiling in fields, working with animals, or engaging in crafts that leave you covered in dust, soil, sweat and grime. The priority is always survival and production, growing food, making goods, sustaining your family and community. Intricate personal hygiene is relegated to a distant concern, a luxury of time and effort that you simply cannot afford. Your life is a constant cycle of toil and grime where cleanliness is a fleeting aspiration, not a daily reality. And then there are the urban centres, which struggle profoundly with waste management due to the complete absence of integrated sewage systems. Imagine living in a city where streets are often open cesspools where human and animal waste collects, ferments and reeks. These are not just unpleasant, they are environmental health hazards, breeding grounds for disease. The stench is a constant assault on your senses, a pervasive, inescapable reminder of the monumental failure of urban planning and public health. This reality further underscores how deeply economic limitations and resource mismanagement intertwine with and ultimately dictate the quality of your daily life and personal cleanliness, always shadowed by nature's relentless fury. As you navigate this medieval existence, you quickly become acutely aware of an even more powerful omnipresent force, dictating the very conditions of your life, nature's relentless fury and universal threats. These aren't just inconvenient weather patterns, they are existential challenges that fundamentally shape your hygiene practices, your health and your understanding of the world. Recurrent plague outbreaks, most notably the terrifying Black Death that swept across Europe, profoundly impacted hygiene practices for centuries to come. This wasn't a one-time event. The threat of plague became a persistent shadow, fueling a deep-seated collective fear that influenced almost every aspect of public health and personal care. The prevailing, deeply flawed medical belief was that opening pores through bathing invited sickness. Therefore, a hot bath, which you might associate with comfort and cleansing, became a terrifying gateway for the very disease that decimated populations. This belief, born of desperation and ignorance of germ theory, contributed directly to a decline in full-body washing and a pervasive fear of water as a conduit for illness. You lived with this fear, making choices that felt like survival, even if they were ultimately counterproductive. Harsh winter conditions severely limited outdoor bathing options. Imagine trying to wash in a freezing river or stream, the biting cold making the very thought unbearable. Even heating water for indoor washing became an arduous, resource-intensive task, often outweighing the perceived benefits of a wash. Fuel was precious and the effort to bring water to a usable temperature immense. During these months, hygiene was pushed to minimal survival-oriented efforts. You'd focus on staying warm, staying fed, and simply enduring the biting cold discomfort, with cleanliness becoming an almost forgotten luxury. Your skin would crack and chap from the cold and lack of proper washing, adding to your discomfort. Natural water sources like rivers, lakes, and communal wells were indispensable multi-purpose sites. They served as your primary sources for drinking water for washing clothes, and distressingly often for waste disposal. This confluence of uses created a fertile ground for the rapid spread of waterborne diseases throughout communities. Dysentery, cholera, and other gastrointestinal ailments were common, constantly threatening your health. Every sip of water, every interaction with a communal water source carried an unseen threat. This forced you to live with a constant low-level anxiety about your health, a profound understanding that the very essence of life, water, could also be its most dangerous vector. The complete lack of formal public health infrastructure left medieval populations largely defenseless against widespread illnesses. There were no sanitation departments, no widespread medical knowledge of infection control, and certainly no government agencies dedicated to ensuring clean water or managing waste. Instead, you relied on rudimentary personal practices, often misguided medical beliefs like balancing humours, and the occasional, often ineffective interventions of local healers or wise women. This pervasive lack of organised public health created a constant sense of vulnerability, a feeling that you were perpetually at the mercy of unseen forces. Beyond disease, environmental factors within your dwellings also exacerbated hygiene challenges. Persistent dampness in stone castles or poorly constructed timber huts contributed to conditions where mouldy clothes were common, and chronic respiratory issues were widespread. The chill of unheated spaces made it difficult to dry clothes or to warm yourself sufficiently after even a partial wash, leading to lingering dampness and discomfort. This added a persistent musty smell to daily life, a constant reminder of the environmental battle you waged within your own home. It was a world where nature in all its forms was a relentless adversary to personal cleanliness and good health, shaping your routines and your very chances of survival, which brings us to how power and control impacted these daily realities. Within this complex interplay of personal struggle, cultural mandates and macro-environmental pressures, you find that the mechanisms of power control and human response, often intertwined with the very concepts of purity and pollution, ultimately dictated the bounds of acceptable hygiene and the consequences of deviating from them. This wasn't just about what you could do, but what you were allowed or even compelled to do by those in authority. The Church, as you've observed, held immense moral and institutional authority, which it wielded to significantly influence public policy regarding hygiene. Its power was not just spiritual, but intensely practical, impacting your daily life. The most striking example of this was its successful campaign to close down public bathhouses. This wasn't a minor regulatory adjustment, it was a profound demonstration of top-down control over personal practices. By framing public bathing as morally corrupt and a source of sin, the Church effectively transformed a traditional hub of social interaction and physical cleansing into a site of spiritual danger. You learned to view these places with suspicion, internalizing the Church's powerful message even if you sometimes longed for a warm soak. This action showcased how effectively religious authority could dictate not just beliefs but bodily practices. Despite the pervasive personal struggles with hygiene that affected everyone, monarchs and high-ranking lords were acutely aware of the need to project an image of authority and superiority. They did this not by being demonstrably clean by modern standards, but by using outward appearances to maintain their status and command respect. This involved elaborate, often heavily perfumed clothing, which visually masked accumulated grime and olfactorily overpowered underlying body odors. Visible cleanliness, particularly of outer garments and linens, served as a crucial part of this image. You would see a lord in his rich perfumed robes, understanding that this display of ostentation, however achieved, was essential for maintaining his position at the pinnacle of the social hierarchy, a silent display of power designed to awe and impress. The ability of the elite to command servants for the laborious task of heating water and assisting with personal cleaning visibly underscored the practical privileges of their position in the social hierarchy. While you as a commoner might struggle for hours to heat a single bucket of water, a lord could have a dozen servants dedicated to ensuring his comfort. This wasn't just a convenience. It was a silent display of command, a tangible manifestation of the resources and labour they controlled. You would witness this understanding that access to cleanliness was a direct consequence of one's place in the hierarchy, a stark reminder of the privileges of power. Curiously, amidst these rigid hierarchies, the widespread acceptance of body odour across all strata, from commoner to king, subtly reinforced a shared human condition. While efforts to mask or mitigate odours differed greatly by class, the underlying truth was that everyone was subject to the same biological realities. This created a strange commonality, a shared sensory experience that transcended some class divisions. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared human struggle, a reminder that beneath the silks and the rags everyone sweated, everyone produced odors, and everyone faced the daily challenge of a less than pristine world. Finally, governing powers largely lacked centralized public health mandates or organized sanitation efforts. The responsibility for hygiene, waste management, and disease prevention was largely devolved to local communities and individuals. This was a pervasive hands-off approach that amplified individual struggles and vulnerabilities. There was no overarching governmental strategy for clean water or disease prevention. You were left to your own devices or the limited resources of your immediate community to cope with unsanitary conditions. This absence of centralized control meant that your well-being, especially concerning hygiene, was often a matter of local custom, personal effort, and sheer luck, further highlighting the rudimentary nature of legal and enforcement mechanisms. Delving deeper into the mechanisms of power and control, you realize that in the absence of modern governance, legal and enforcement mechanisms for hygiene were rudimentary at best and often deeply intertwined with moral or religious dictates, rather than scientific understanding. This created a patchwork of localized customs and individual responsibility, rather than a cohesive public health strategy. The widespread closure of public bathhouses serves as a prime example of social control exerted through religious authority over daily life. Primarily driven by ecclesiastical decrees and moral panic, these closures were not a result of health-based legislation, but rather of a moral judgment against what was perceived as indecency and sin. The Church's power was so pervasive that it could effectively shut down institutions that had been part of urban life for centuries, turning a hub of bathing into a site of spiritual condemnation. You would have witnessed this shift, understanding that the powerful force of the Church could profoundly alter communal practices, dictating what was acceptable, even in matters of personal care. Decisions regarding public health and sanitation were largely decentralized, falling to local customs or individual discretion, rather than being dictated by a centralized legal framework. A village might have traditional rules about where waste could be dumped, or a town might designate certain areas for communal washing. However, these were often informal and varied wildly from place to place. There was no king's decree on sewage systems, no royal mandate for clean water. This led to highly variable and often ineffective solutions, creating a constant struggle against unsanitary conditions that depended largely on the initiative or lack thereof of local leaders and communities. You'd see the stark difference between one village that tried to manage its waste and another that simply let it accumulate. The absence of robust public sewage systems or organised waste collection in urban areas was a glaring reflection of a systemic lack of governmental enforcement or investment in basic public health infrastructure. Cities, the densest populations, were often the most unsanitary. Instead of engineered solutions, the streets themselves became the primary repository for waste. This meant that the responsibility for dealing with refuse largely fell to individuals who often took the path of least resistance. The perpetual stench, the visible refuse, and the constant threat of disease were direct consequences of this governmental inaction. You'd navigate these streets holding your breath, understanding that the authorities simply weren't equipped, or perhaps didn't care enough to address the fundamental issues of public cleanliness. Informal practices such as shouting "guard low" as chamber pot contents were emptied into the streets from upper windows highlight the crude ad hoc nature of waste disposal in the absence of formal laws. This wasn't a regulated system. It was a daily dance with foulness, a loose understanding between residents and passers-by. There were no fines for indiscriminate dumping, no public services to collect and process waste. The street served as the communal receptacle, and its contents were simply left to gravity foraging animals and the occasional rainfall to disperse. You learned to keep an ear out for the shouted warning, a grim reminder of the daily realities of urban sanitation. Most critically, without a scientific understanding of germ theory, medieval governing bodies were fundamentally unable to implement truly effective public health measures. Their efforts, if any, were based on superstition, religious belief, or a rudimentary understanding of visible filth. They simply didn't know why people got sick from tainted water or poor sanitation. This profound and dangerous ignorance meant that even well-intentioned efforts were often misdirected or insufficient, leaving communities vulnerable to widespread disease and unsanitary conditions that could easily have been mitigated with modern knowledge. You lived in a world where the authorities, however powerful, were ultimately powerless against the invisible enemies that bred in the filth, a reality overshadowed by the constant threat of death and disease. As you live through this era, you're constantly reminded that hovering over every aspect of your existence, shaping your decisions and your very worldview, is the shadow of death and disease. This isn't just a distant threat. It's a constant companion, a motivator for survival that deeply, sometimes tragically, impacts your hygiene practices and your understanding of life itself. The ever-present threat of devastating epidemics, most terrifyingly, the Black Death, served as a powerful, albeit often misguided, motivator for many hygiene practices. Imagine the sheer terror that swept through communities, the sight of neighbours sickening and dying within days. In this context, any practice believed to offer protection, no matter how illogical, was embraced. This fear fueled the belief that opening pores through bathing invited sickness, thereby creating a deep-seated collective fear of water as a conduit for the plague. You, like everyone else, would internalize this terrifying logic. Better to smell, you'd reason, than to open your body to the invisible, deadly miasma carried on the air believed to enter through your pores. This was not a choice for comfort, but a desperate, life-preserving decision born of trauma and a profound lack of scientific understanding. The widespread acceptance of body odour, pest infestations, and generally unhygienic living conditions was in essence a pragmatic response to a world where mere survival often took precedence over cleanliness. When faced with famine, war, or plague, the luxury of a clean body or home simply faded into insignificance. You learned to live with the pervasive discomforts, the itching, the smells, the dirt, because the alternative, expending precious resources and energy on futile cleansing efforts, or worse, risking disease by bathing, seemed far more dangerous. It was a daily compromise with discomfort, a silent agreement to endure the less pleasant realities in favour of simply staying alive. Prevailing medical beliefs, including the notion of bad humours and the therapeutic value of sweating, were often endorsed by authorities both secular and religious. These theories, based on ancient Greek medicine, suggested that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sweating was considered a healthy process to purge bad humours from the body, thereby restoring balance. This inadvertently justified some unsanitary practices contributing to the pervasive, medically fragrant reality of your world. You might even feel a sense of well-being after a good sweat, believing it was literally cleaning you from the inside out, a strange form of internal hygiene. Death from infection and disease, frequently exacerbated by poor hygiene and a complete lack of medical knowledge, was a common and inescapable reality. You would witness friends, family and neighbours succumb to ailments that modern medicine would easily cure. Infant mortality was tragically high and life expectancy was low. This fostered a fatalistic worldview, a quiet resignation to fate that minimized the perceived efficacy of complex cleanliness routines. When death was so common, and often swift, the daily grime seemed less significant. Why bother with elaborate washing when a sudden fever or a contaminated well could take you at any moment? This resignation to fate meant that personal hygiene was often seen as a minor concern in the grand scheme of survival, a quiet acceptance of life's inherent fragility. As you move through this world, you keenly feel the impact of this constant threat and its deep influence on social interactions and communication. Beyond the grim realities, it's worth revisiting an element you've touched upon: the nuanced nature of communication and social etiquette in a world where true cleanliness was a rarity. The pervasive presence of body odour and environmental smells didn't just exist. It actively shaped how you interacted with others, subtly dictating acceptable personal distances and conversational norms. You developed a heightened sense of olfactory awareness and unspoken language of scent that influenced every social encounter. Imagine meeting someone for the first time. Your initial assessment wouldn't just be visual, it would be profoundly olfactory. The subtle or not so subtle scent emanating from them would immediately, if unconsciously, inform your perception. Was it the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth common to most, or something sharper indicating recent hard labour, or perhaps a faint whiff of expensive perfume signalling noble birth? This constant shared sensory backdrop meant that personal space was often instinctively adjusted. You wouldn't press too close to a stranger, not out of unfriendliness, but out of a practical understanding of the olfactory landscape. A person's appearance, and crucially the relative cleanliness and whiteness of their linen undergarments, served as a potent non-verbal indicator of their social standing. This wasn't just about superficiality. It spoke volumes about resources, diligence, and even moral character. A clean, bright linen shirt beneath a worn tunic could elevate your perceived status, suggesting that despite humble circumstances, you maintained a level of self-respect and order. It was a visual signal, a quiet communication that you were one of the good ones, or at least one of the striving ones. You learned to scrutinize these details in others, and to present your own linen as best you could, understanding its power as a social currency. The use of pomanders and perfumes, particularly among the elite, functioned as a sophisticated form of social communication. For the nobility, these fragrant accessories were more than just odour masks. They were statements. Wearing a pomander or having the delicate scent of rosewater about your person signalled refinement status and an explicit attempt to differentiate oneself from the general funk of the common populace. It was a fragrant barrier, a way of asserting a higher standard of living and a more delicate sensibility. You would immediately recognise the distinct, often strong sense of the wealthy, understanding them as part of their identity and their claim to superiority. Navigating crowded medieval spaces, be it a bustling market square, a packed church on a feast day, or a narrow winding street, required a practiced tolerance for strong odours. Your senses quickly adapted to this constant onslaught. You developed an unspoken etiquette of selective sensory processing, learning to filter out the most overwhelming smells, focusing instead on the visual cues and verbal exchanges necessary for polite interaction. It was a daily negotiation with the nose, a mental strategy to maintain decorum and sanity in an olfactory challenging environment. You learn to breathe through your mouth more often than not, a small but essential adaptation. Offering clean garments or scented water for hand washing to guests was a significant gesture of hospitality. This simple act underscored the social value placed on efforts towards cleanliness, however basic they might be. It was a mark of respect and welcome, an acknowledgement of the guest's journey, and an attempt to offer comfort. If you were a guest, receiving a basin of warm-scented water would be a memorable moment, a sign of genuine warmth, and an indication of your host's status and generosity. This small ritual spoke volumes about social relations and the inherent value of even momentary freshness. Ultimately, the collective experience of shared odours fostered a sense of communal suffering, which in a paradoxical way contributed to a baseline of social acceptance. While extreme filth might invite ostracism, a general level of human smell was understood and tolerated. This common sensory reality created an unspoken bond, a shared understanding that everyone faced similar challenges. It meant that you wouldn't typically judge someone harshly for a faint body odour, for you knew your own might be similar. It was a collective shrug, a silent agreement to tolerate what couldn't easily be changed, and to focus on the more pressing matters of community and survival. which informed the cultural performances of cleanliness you witnessed daily. Continuing our exploration of the social fabric, you recognize that the regular changing of linen undergarments, even if worn beneath soiled outer layers, was perhaps the most critical and often visible performance of personal self-respect. In a world without widespread bathing, the state of your underthings became a powerful silent declaration. You knew that while your outermost clothing might be stained with the grime of labour or travel, a fresh linen shirt or shift, even if simple and well-worn, spoke volumes. It was a clear non-verbal message that you were diligent, that you cared about your person, and that you made an effort to manage the unavoidable realities of medieval dirt. This performance was a daily ritual, a quiet act of defiance against the pervasive uncleanliness, allowing you to present a better, albeit hidden version of yourself to the world. Wearing a perceptibly clean and bright linen shirt or shift, especially when visible at the collar or cuffs, functioned as a powerful non-verbal social cue that communicated your virtue diligence and even a degree of economic stability to the community. A pristine white linen garment, however brief its moment of glory, suggested that you had the means to own multiple changes of clothing and the resources time, water, labour to keep them laundered. For the commoner, it was a testament to hard work and careful management. For the noble, it was a subtle display of their household's capacity and wealth. You learned to read these signals on others, making quick judgments about their character and standing, and you also understood that your own efforts in this regard were constantly under communal observation. For the elite, the display and use of luxury items directly related to personal scent, imported perfumes, elaborate pomanders, scented gloves, became a performative act of distinguishing their status. These weren't just personal comforts, they were tools of social stratification. Dabbing on expensive rose oil or holding a gem-encrusted pomander to your nose was a clear assertion of a superior, if still relative, level of cleanliness. It created a fragrant barrier, a distinct olfactory identity that set you apart from the common smells of the populace. This was a form of conspicuous consumption, a way of asserting power and refinement through the senses. You'd catch a fleeting exotic scent from a noble and understand its implicit message of distance and superiority. Even simple acts like carefully combing one's hair with an elaborately carved comb made from bone or horn could be interpreted as a subtle performance of personal discipline and a commitment to one's appearance. While extensive hair washing was rare and difficult, neat, untangled, and relatively pest-free hair was a sign of care. It suggested that you took pride in your person, even in a world where physical perfection was unattainable. This small daily ritual, often performed publicly, contributed to your overall social presentation, silently communicating your adherence to certain standards of self-maintenance. You might take a moment longer with your comb, consciously shaping your hair, knowing it contributed to the image you projected. The communal acceptance of a certain level of body odour meant that blending in with the prevailing scentscape was in itself a default social performance. You didn't necessarily strive to smell entirely different from everyone else. Rather, you tried to avoid being noticeably worse. While exceptional foulness could certainly invite social judgment and ostracism, the general shared experience of a baseline level of fragrance created a communal understanding. To smell like everyone else was in a way to conform to be a part of the accepted social order. It was a delicate balance: stand out too much positively or negatively, and you risked drawing unwanted attention. This subtle performance shaped your daily interactions, reminding you that in the medieval world, even your smell had a social role to play, a role deeply intertwined with the spiritual frameworks and superstitions that permeated the age. As you continue to reflect on the nuances of medieval hygiene, you find that the widespread medical superstition that hot water opened pores to disease deeply intertwined hygiene practices with a pervasive fear of illness. This wasn't just a fleeting anxiety. It was a deeply ingrained cultural belief that influenced decisions about bathing for centuries. You, like everyone else, internalised this fear, transforming the simple act of taking a warm bath into a perceived health risk. The belief that pores were tiny doorways for sickness and plague to seep in made water, once a symbol of purity, into something potentially treacherous. This fear, though rooted in ignorance of germ theory, was a genuine life-altering motivator, shaping countless personal choices and ensuring that thorough cleansing remained a rare and suspect activity. The Church, in its immense moral and institutional authority, played a dominant role in shaping hygiene norms. Its vigorous condemnation of public bathhouses, particularly those where mixed genders gathered, had a profound and lasting impact. By associating mixed-gender bathing with sin and moral corruption, the Church successfully led to their widespread decline and closure across much of Europe. You would hear sermons railing against such establishments, reinforcing the idea that nakedness and communal washing were not only immodest, but spiritually dangerous. This powerful moral campaign effectively curtailed one of the few organised communal approaches to hygiene, leaving individuals and families to their own often inadequate devices. The Church's influence here was less about direct legislation and more about shaping public opinion and moral conscience, turning a practical necessity into a moral hazard. Modesty and the pursuit of spiritual purity were often emphasised implicitly or explicitly, advocating for dry cleaning methods and partial washes as more virtuous than full-body immersion. The focus shifted from external cleanliness to internal purity. You were taught that excessive attention to the body's comforts, especially the sensual pleasure of a hot bath, could be a distraction from the path to salvation. Consequently, partial washes done quickly and discreetly were seen as more modest and spiritually upright. It was a subtle but pervasive message your soul's condition was paramount, and the body's state, if clean enough to avoid obvious offence, was secondary. You learned to value humility over indulgence, even in the most basic acts of self-care. Monastic orders, while sometimes maintaining regular washing routines, often framed these acts as spiritual disciplines intended for purification and humility, rather than purely for physical cleanliness. For monks and nuns, a scheduled wash might be part of preparing for prayer or an act of cleansing before a sacred ritual. It wasn't about feeling fresh or smelling good in a worldly sense. It was about symbolically purifying the body to better serve God. This distinct motivation meant that their hygiene practices, though perhaps more consistent than the general populace, were imbued with a spiritual purpose that transcended mere physical comfort or social expectation. You would observe their practices with a sense of quiet respect, understanding their unique perspective. The prevailing medical belief that sweating was a healthy process to purge bad humours from the body further complicated the perception of personal odour. This theory suggested that illness resulted from an imbalance of bodily fluids, and sweating was a natural mechanism to restore that balance. Consequently, body odour was sometimes tolerated or even justified as a natural bodily function, a sign that your body was actively expelling toxins and maintaining health. This contributed to the pervasive, medically fragrant reality of medieval life, creating a cultural acceptance that, while perhaps unappealing by modern standards, was rooted in the era's best understanding of human physiology. You might even feel a sense of internal cleansing after a good sweat, believing your body was working as it should. Ultimately, the concept of spiritual cleanliness, encouraged by religious authorities, often overshadowed or was even seen as a substitute for rigorous physical hygiene. You were constantly reminded that the state of your soul was far more important than the state of your skin. This emphasis created a unique framework where purity of spirit could in some context render physical dirt irrelevant or even virtuous. However, ritualistic uses of water for baptism or blessing, distinct from daily washing, highlight the profound spiritual significance placed on certain forms of water-based cleanliness, separate from practical hygiene. These were moments when water was not feared but revered a conduit for grace rather than a carrier of disease, a stark contrast that revealed the deeply complex relationship medieval people had with the element of water. This intricate web of beliefs inevitably shaped the most intimate aspects of life: love, marriage, and family. As you reflect on the complexities of medieval hygiene, the realities of love, marriage, and family life come into sharper focus, deeply coloured by the challenges of cleanliness and personal comfort. The ubiquitous presence of body odour and basic hygiene conditions would have fundamentally shaped the sensory realities of intimate relationships, influencing perceptions of attraction and closeness in ways you might find utterly alien today. Your understanding of a partner's appeal would not include the fresh laundered scent of modern times, but rather a more earthy human reality. Imagine the sensory details of intimacy. The faint scent of wood smoke, of unwashed skin that had only known partial cleansings of the day's labour, all would be intertwined with the more pleasant aromas of herbs, or perhaps a rare perfume. Attraction in this era was necessarily different. It wasn't about pristine physical presentation. Instead, it would be built on qualities such as character, resilience, shared values, and perhaps a subtle personal aroma that became familiar and even comforting over time. You would grow accustomed to the unique scent of your beloved, seeing it as an intrinsic part of their being rather than something to be masked or eradicated. Marriage, which was often a pragmatic alliance based on land lineage or economic necessity, implicitly factored in these realities of shared uncleanliness. The expectation of a perfectly clean partner was simply not a consideration. Instead, a spouse's efforts towards basic maintenance, changing linen, combing hair, performing partial washes, would be appreciated as practical considerations rather than romantic gestures. You would share a bed, a home, and all the attendant smells and discomforts with your partner, making any strong judgment about their personal fastidiousness somewhat moot. It was a shared reality, and intimacy often meant accepting each other, grime and all. Women, as the primary caretakers within the household, likely faced particular pressure to maintain a certain, albeit rudimentary, level of cleanliness for their children and their living space. This wasn't solely for aesthetic reasons, but for the perceived health and well-being of the family, however limited their understanding of disease. The constant labour of fetching water-washing clothes with harsh lye in cold rivers and managing domestic waste often fell squarely on their shoulders, adding immense physical burden to their daily lives. You would see mothers tirelessly working their hands raw, striving against overwhelming odds to create a marginally cleaner environment for their loved ones. The stark lack of private bathing facilities within most homes meant that personal care routines were often communal or carried out in highly visible spaces. Whether it was the shared bath barrel in the courtyard or a quick wipe down by the hearth, truly private moments for self-care were rare. This constant visibility meant that family members were intimately aware of each other's hygiene efforts or lack thereof. This shared vulnerability, however, could also foster a unique form of familial bonding. It was a collective experience of enduring discomfort and striving for small moments of relief, forging a quiet, unspoken understanding between those who lived under the same roof. Perhaps one of the most striking, if unglamorous, forms of familial bonding came from the shared experience of coping with pests like lice and fleas. These were not merely individual annoyances, they were a collective household challenge. Parents and children often engaged in communal combing rituals, meticulously picking lice and nits from each other's hair. This wasn't a chore to be avoided, it was a quiet, necessary act of mutual care and interdependence. You would sit patiently as your mother or sibling worked through your hair, the rhythmic scrape of the comb, a familiar, even comforting sound, even amidst the discomfort of the pests. It was a tangible expression of family unity, a silent agreement to help each other navigate the pervasive annoyances of medieval life, forging enduring connections amidst shared, unglamorous struggle. As we reach the culmination of our journey through medieval hygiene, you find yourself with a comprehensive understanding of how deeply interconnected every aspect of life was, and how profoundly different your daily existence would have been. From the overarching structures of society to the smallest, most intimate moments of personal care, the medieval world presented a relentless, often overwhelming challenge to cleanliness. This wasn't a world of pristine surfaces or refreshing showers. It was a world defined by ingenuity, resignation, and an enduring struggle against the elements and the unseen threats of disease. You have walked through drafty homes where privacy was a luxury, and shared spaces meant a constant awareness of others, often including livestock. You've tasted the monotonous, coarse diet, and understood how it contributed to your body's natural odors and your dental woes. You've felt the pervasive chill of unheated homes and the ever-present dampness, understanding how they contributed to the general sense of grime. You've grappled with the fear of water born of superstition and the terrifying reality of plague, making a simple bath feel like a dangerous invitation for death. And you've learned the pragmatic necessity of sponge baths and linen shifts, your primary defence against a constantly dirty world. You've imagined the distinctive, often strong smells that permeated medieval life, a complex tapestry of human, animal and environmental odours that made committed to being unforgettable an apt description. You've witnessed the constant battle against pests from lice to fleas, which were not just annoyances but unwanted roommates for everyone. And you've endured the crude realities of waste disposal, from guardrobes to chamber pots, emptied into the streets, understanding how profoundly different the very act of using the toilet truly was. You've explored how your labour, whether in the fields or in the home, continuously produced sweat and grime, pushing personal cleanliness to a secondary concern behind survival. And you've seen how childhood, far from being a time of gentle care, was an early introduction to these harsh realities, with high mortality rates and informal utilitarian hygiene education. Beyond the tangible, you've understood the subtle language of cleanliness in social interactions, how clean linen communicated status, how pomanders created fragrant social barriers, and how navigating crowded, smelly spaces required a practiced tolerance. You've delved into the spiritual frameworks that demonized bathing and promoted dry modesty, and how these beliefs shaped everyday choices. You've seen how love and family life existed amidst these challenging sensory realities, forging bonds through shared struggles with pests and discomfort. And you've understood how your clan's perceived cleanliness contributed to its reputation, making hygiene a public rather than private concern. Finally, you've grasped the foundational realities that underpinned it all, the inescapable social hierarchy that dictated access to water, fuel and labour, the core economy that limited resources and made basic soap a harsh utility, and nature's relentless fury from plague to harsh winters which constantly threatened health and pushed cleanliness to the fringes of survival. You've seen how the mechanisms of power, from the church's decrees to the absence of public health infrastructure, cemented these conditions. You now understand that medieval hygiene wasn't about spotless surfaces. It was about managing a constant, pervasive battle against dirt, disease and discomfort. It was a world where survival often overshadowed all other concerns, and where ingenuity, resilience and a quiet acceptance of less than ideal conditions were paramount. As you contemplate these profound differences, allow your mind to drift from the persistent smells and the endless itching, finding comfort in the silence and the simple, unseen cleanliness of your own surroundings. As the final echoes of the medieval world gently fade, allow your mind to slowly, softly drift back to the quiet comfort of your own space. You've walked through centuries of dust, smoke and struggle, experienced the constant battle against grime and unseen threats, and understood the profound daily realities that shaped every medieval life. That persistent itch, the faint lingering scent of damp earth and wood smoke, let those sensations soften and dissolve into the stillness around you. Take a deep, calming breath. Feel the clean, fresh air fill your lungs, a luxury beyond measure for your medieval counterpart. Appreciate the silent hum of modern life, the invisible infrastructure that keeps your water pure and your waste far from your streets. Think of the warmth that emanates from your walls, the simple convenience of a hot shower, the gentle scent of soap, the soft luxury of clean linens. These are not just amenities, they are profound testaments to centuries of progress, offering a peace of mind that was utterly unknown to those we've just visited. Let your thoughts gently settle, releasing any lingering impressions of discomfort or hardship. The figures of the past with their layered wool, their diligent linen changes and their desperate fights against pests are now safely tucked away in the annals of history. They rest, and so should you. There's no need to fetch water from a communal well, no fear of pores opening to plague, no constant battle against unseen enemies or pervasive odors tonight. Just the soft, quiet rhythm of your own breathing, the comforting stillness of your surroundings. Allow your muscles to relax, your eyelids to grow heavy. The journey is complete. The history has been told. Now only peaceful slumber awaits.